We are witnessing the end of a period of capitalism defined by widespread free trade. George Bush will use the hegemony of the United States to give the impression that the United States has the legitimacy to be the world's policeman. Because a number of countries are saying we don't want widespread liberalization anymore, especially in agriculture, etc., because otherwise our people will suffer, our agriculture will die, and so on. So this happy neoliberal globalization has also been a social war, and sovereignty means the people in a democracy. The sovereign is the people. But we believe that, as things stand, the way the European Union operates is far too undemocratic to consider that there is a European people. We're going to have military cooperation and so on. Then, automatically, a European defense will emerge, but that's not how it works. You need a strategy. Defense isn't just about equipment, it's also based on a common doctrine, common interests. Do you think in foreign policy that it's really shared? Actually, Europe is full of contradictions on this subject. There's no guarantee that the end of the United States' dominance over globalization will bring peace, joy, and prosperity.
We return for this second interview with the France Insoumise deputy, Arnaud Legal, member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. First of all, we wanted to thank him for the time he gave us, and also thank you for the warm reception of the first episode. This interview is twice as long, so feel free to let us know in the comments what you prefer. You will also find in the description the links that aim to further explore Mr. Deputy's statements, and please forgive us in advance. There are some unexpected zooms due to a bad camera setting. This has been fixed. For future interviews, if you would like to see us invite someone, other deputies and senators, simply write to us at this address, no matter your political affiliation. Thank you and enjoy watching. Mr. Deputy, hello. Thank you for welcoming us today in your office at the National Assembly for these new interviews that our YouTube channel wishes to launch regarding foreign affairs. Could you first of all give us an overview of how the world order has evolved since the end of the Cold War? And how does that shed light on the way you currently think about geopolitics?
First of all, what seems important to me is to point out that we are currently living through the end of the neoliberal globalization era, as it was conceived and implemented at the end of the Cold War, that is, in the 1990s. We are living through the end, more precisely, of a period of capitalism that was characterized by widespread free trade and the hegemony of the United States, a dollar-based financialization that had been made possible after, I'm not going to go all the way back to the 1970s, but after the end of the dollar's convertibility to gold, the revival of the hegemony of the United States, and a whole set of institutions like the World Trade Organization created in the 1990s, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, which shifted to neoliberalism in the 1980s and 1990s, and so on. All of that was what we used to call the Washington Consensus at the time, so it was under American hegemony. Remember George Bush's speech right at the same time as the war in Iraq, so George Bush and his peers talking about a new world order. What did he mean by that? We've kind of forgotten. We can see that the United States felt all-powerful. It was at the same time that the journalist Crotomer popularized the notion of a unipolar world. And what do they mean by that? George Bush will use the hegemony of the United States to suggest the United States is justified as the world's policeman. But unlike the current period, at that time they hid behind international law. George Bush, in his speech about the New World Order, finally says, the Cold War is over. We will be able to apply international law, especially because there is no longer a systematic Soviet veto, etc. There is no longer a so-called veto war in the Security Council. But obviously this conception of international law will be put at the service of American imperialism and of their domination over this, of their attempt to maintain their hegemony over this neoliberal globalization despite their military, monetary, and even cultural domination. At that time, there was no opposition at all. At the same time, they saw their industry erode, their productive base erode. So I'm not going to give numbers here, but there is a disconnect between the value as it is shown, and the actual production of goods, of products and goods in the United States. From there, they think they can outsource industrial production to China, for example. Remember, the Chinese didn't come to steal our capital. It was the European and American capitalists who relocated, who invested capital in China. And in fact, in 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, and so on. Then September 11 happened, which was an explosion. The world's leading power struck at its very heart. Well, I don't agree with all the conspiracy theories that claim the Americans did it on purpose. No, I don't. What is certain is they used September 11th to launch a series of wars, which deepened the contradictions of the order they claimed to embody and undermined the foundations of their power. As I was saying, the 2008 moment refers to the period from 2008 to 2010. Why? Because we have an element of the crises, first of all, the subprime crisis, which accelerated the unraveling of neoliberal globalization centered on the United States. The United States is losing its preeminence. It remains the leading financial power, but it is no longer the leading productive power. And above all, everyone sees, the whole world sees, that it's Chinese capitalism, it's the Chinese economy that is reviving the world economy, including with major construction plans, etc., without necessarily having the global strategic vision that was later attributed to them, which would come later. At that time, they mainly focused on construction. Let me remind you that between 2011 and 2013 or 2014, if I remember correctly, more concrete was poured in China than in the entire 20th century in the United States. That's what I mentioned earlier. When George Bush talks about the New World Order in 1990, he says, "We are going to implement a global economy." They don't say it anymore. Now, we'll come back to that. It's not a minor detail, but why is it cracking? Because there's a decisive point. There have been a whole series of wars that were carried out against the United Nations as advice. The war in Iraq, I remind you, was carried out against the United Nations as advice, and so on. So afterwards, we cling to it because the United States needs that legitimacy. So we carry out interventions afterwards, which are more or less validated by the United Nations, but the war itself is carried out against the United Nations. The turning point from that point of view is Libya. Why? Because in Libya, for the first time in 2011, the Security Council authorized an intervention in the name of the responsibility to protect. It's a compromise between total state sovereignty, allowing any action, and having no international protection for populations. And on the other hand, the duty or the right of generalized intervention, which we know was always applied inconsistently. This is about the responsibility to protect, which is a compromise. The Security Council gives a mandate to prevent Gaddafi from massacring his people. The question isn't whether he was really going to massacre them or not, but in any case, they give this mandate. And the Chinese and the Russians abstain. They don't use their veto. So indirectly, they allow an intervention, except that very quickly. What happens next? England, the United States, France, Nicolas Sarkozy's France. We also know the whole issue of the Libyan affair for Nicolas Sarkozy go beyond this mandate, this resolution. Notably carrying out airstrikes that were not planned, and even going as far as regime change, even though that was explicitly excluded from the resolution. And so now the Chinese, and especially the Russians, are saying and making it clear that they got tricked once, and they won't be tricked a second time. Third crisis, which is we can't give a specific date, but what's fundamental is the climate crisis. It's that we're seeing an acceleration of the war on nature, which didn't start in 2008, but it's happening now. So we have these three crises, these three turning points. Crisis of the unipolar system built around the United States in the 1990s after their victory over the Soviet Union. Crisis of the United Nations collective security system, in any case, of the Security Council. And all of this on top of the climate crisis, which is a new factor because it disrupts existing balances or even existing imbalances. But to adapt, that's what capitalism does. It makes money from it. It makes money from the ecological crisis, carbon quotas, and so on. A whole set of completely mind-boggling measures that solve nothing except for creating new ways to speculate. So I should clarify that when I say capitalism is dead, that doesn't mean that neoliberalism itself on a local or national scale is dead. For example, what the Macronists constantly propose is to keep cutting solidarity, to keep questioning social security in order to constantly expand the market sphere. That's a form of neoliberalism, but on the other hand, the global infrastructures of neoliberalism are dead because they were largely based on free trade and so on. But here we see a capitalism
s'est mis en place depuis quelques années.
That is based on three major characteristics. We call it tributary capitalism, but we could give it another name. Basically, it's the exacerbation of the intertwining between war and commerce. So we have a remilitarization, especially of strategic routes. And you can see it happening right before our eyes. It's something subtle, something diffuse. But if you look at the game of military bases around the world, militarized ports that serve both commerce and military bases and so on, there have been upheavals in recent years. Then, the breakdown of the classic rules of economic competition. Well, we never really believed in free and undistorted competition. Only a few people at the European Commission believed in it. And unfortunately, some national leaders believed in it too, or at least they obeyed. And that dragged us down. Because while others were subsidizing their strategic economy, while the Chinese or the Americans were subsidizing, and they were absolutely right to do it, especially in the digital sector in the 90s, and we see the result now, we're completely left behind. The Europeans said the market would ensure free and undistorted competition. All of this is being called into question, and we're seeing more and more the return of unilateral protectionism from the United States themselves. First and foremost, Donald Trump making a lot of noise. This has been building for some time. Remember the Doha round, the Doha negotiations of the World Trade Organization, which failed, if I recall correctly, in 2008 or 2010, it doesn't really matter, on the basis of failure, because a number of countries said, we don't want generalized liberalization anymore, especially in agriculture, because otherwise our people will suffer, our agriculture will die out, and so on. And finally, and most importantly, the return to openly imperial logics. Now let me explain. Capitalism in one way or another is always somewhat imperialistic. The major powers, their international policy, is inseparable from economic interests. In the 1990s and 2000s, we tended to use filters, or at least it was indirect. What we would call imperialism in any case could be characterized in particular by the imposition of neoliberal policies on African countries, totally unequal trade agreements, and so on. But there was respect for the forms of sovereignty. You can also observe it in NATO's relations. Look at how Donald Trump, his main issue is that we pay and that we come to feed the American military-industrial complex. So he asks that we spend 5% of our gross domestic product on the defense industry, knowing that the vast majority will go to the Americans. Finally, here are the three main characteristics of this new form of international capitalism. And it's a worrying form. Not that we're nostalgic for neoliberal globalization, for free and undistorted competition, for all that nonsense, which were also part of social warfare, what was called the supposedly happy globalization. I'll take just one figure, from 1980 to 2022, according to the United Nations. The share of wages in added value went from 63 to 52% in so-called developed countries, and from 62 to 49% in so-called developing countries. So this happy neoliberal globalization, is it a social war? But if we had to compare it to another era, it would be the period from 1880 to 1914, what Susan Berger called our first globalization. In the 1870s, there was a financial crisis, one of the first financial crises of globalized capitalism. What is the reflex? It's protectionism. So we are not necessarily against it, but under certain conditions. And instead, as the great capitalist powers of the time saw their markets closing, What did they do? They opened new ones. How? By colonizing the world. The great period of colonization was from the 1880s to 1900. They divided Africa, and so on. And each colonial power created its own new markets that way. But that creates friction. I'll skip the details, but it all ends badly. And we end up with the War of 1914-1918. So we are not B. There's no guarantee that the end of the United States' dominance over globalization will bring peace, joy, and prosperity. We have to fight to make sure that the shift in globalization leads to a more united, more cooperative world, and so on. But right now, there are reasons to be concerned. Why? Because, as I already said, the collective security system is in crisis. International law is considered something secondary. And finally, the logic of war is once again becoming the natural logic. For a number of states, there is an urgent need to fight for peace.
But at the moment I'm speaking, it's not very clear whether the reason why President de la République refused to condemn what it was, the aggression by Trump of the United States against Venezuela. It's unclear if Macron no longer believes in international law or just doesn't care. That's a possibility considering the overall record of his 2 terms in foreign policy. Or is it because he thought he could get guarantees from Trump on Ukraine? While the kidnapping of the president of Venezuela took place 2 days before the new meeting of the coalition of volunteers on Ukraine. What did Macron try to form and what came out of this coalition meeting? Emmanuel Macron would be ready to send thousands of French soldiers to guarantee a ceasefire in Ukraine, but only with American guarantees. So we see these lunar supplements. We're being asked to believe in possible American guarantees to send thousands of French soldiers into a war zone. While the President of the United States has just committed one of the most serious acts in terms of international law in decades, and he's openly eyeing Greenland a European territory, and we're asking him for guarantees so we can send thousands of French soldiers into a war zone. All of this is surreal and unacceptable.
Regarding the war in Ukraine and more generally European security, how do you assess the French strategy, the European strategy, and what is your vision for European security? Non-alignment? What would be the connection with NATO, potentially?
If I were harsh, I'd say it's hard to evaluate a strategy when there isn't one. Since I don't think there was any original thought, for a strategy there must be independent thinking, whether we agree with it or not. I'm not sure there was any original thinking from the Europeans, and unfortunately from France on this subject. So we're talking. What we mainly see is that the Europeans have completely lost control. Because they didn't adopt a strategy suited to the reality of the war in Ukraine, they should have acted completely differently. First, from the start, we condemned Russian aggression. Border disputes shouldn't be resolved through war. Yes, disputes existed, but war isn't the answer. The key principle is international law. And besides, as early as 2022, Jean-Luc Mélenchon said it. Ukraine has the right and the duty to defend itself after 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. The economic sanctions hurt the Russians, and so they completely transformed their economy. They tied it much more closely to China in particular. They reformed their productive bases, especially in agriculture, and so on, to make sure that for essential goods, they weren't at the mercy of Western sanctions, and that, one way or another, worked. We're on the 19th round of sanctions. Like it or not, the Russian economy hasn't collapsed, so it has plenty of problems. It's facing a lot of issues, like any country in a war economy, but it hasn't collapsed. So I still remember, in June 2022, Bruno Le Maire was telling us that Russia was on the verge of collapse, and we've been hearing that ever since. And the Europeans shut themselves in and started following the United States, who, from the beginning, were very eager for war. But pretty quickly, we saw signals, even from Biden, we saw signs that they wanted to get out of there, that they weren't going to spend billions and billions forever. So, of course, it benefits them in part because it's about buying American weapons. But in the meantime, their main concern is China. It's the Pacific pivot. And they want, one way or another, to disengage from the European continent. The Europeans didn't want to see it, and they locked themselves into a certain vision.
It's purely
Mystical. There's a very beautiful quote from George Kennan that explains that sometimes, in the end, it's all or nothing. Either we achieve total victory over Russia, or we will disappear as a civilization, as a continent, as a people. That's not true. Neither one nor the other is true. Total military victory is impossible and not a politically desirable goal, because it would mean immense destruction. And in the opposite direction, it's not true that our entire civilization is threatened. We need to look at things in a more concrete and rational way. So from the very beginning, we always said that the solution would be diplomatic and it would have been better to negotiate it, or at least try to negotiate it, or establish a balance of power. When the balance of power was more favorable to Ukraine, that's when things got bogged down. And with Trump's election, it's very clear that the balance of power shifted to the Russian side. So now we're dealing with empty phrases, sometimes even very dangerous ones. And since then, we've been going from one sweeping statement to another. The most recent one is from the Chief of Staff, but it was orchestrated by the President of the Republic. He tells us France has nothing to fear if it is ready to lose its children. Basically, what he's explaining to us is that all of this is absurd. First of all, that's not how you prepare for the possibility of a war. If we really think there's a risk that there could really be a war, that France could really be targeted, we prepare ourselves with a solid industrial base and so on. Everything that the neoliberals who bombard us with warmongering speeches haven't done and have prevented, but who are incapable of having a real national resilience strategy. I advise them to read The New Army by Jaurès, a great book about what national defense really is, national defense. It's not about martial speeches. It's not about bombarding, depriving, and scaring people, with warmongering speeches that also serve to hide. The reality of the current war is that the current war is a social war. In France, I'm coming back to Ukraine because I'm not dodging the issue. We have always warned against this warmongering rhetoric and the dangers of escalation. No, it's out of the question to be in direct war with a nuclear power. Period. If we don't agree on that. The Macronists aren't clear about that. They spend their time saying, no, we don't want to go to war directly with Russia, but we're at war. Ah, yes, but it's a hybrid war, right? But okay, in that case, let's work on strengthening our digital capabilities. Rather than responding with, and the president kept making off-the-cuff statements especially. Also, I forgot to mention it about extended nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence, I talk about it more, it's credible. Everyone knows that French nuclear weapons...
Are you hinting at a potential sharing of nuclear weapons with European countries?
An old Atlanticist and Europeanist idea, as early as the 1970s, Giscard d'Estaing talked about it and had started floating trial balloons on this subject. It's absurd. Nuclear deterrence is not something you share. Either you pretend to believe that our vital interests are at the borders of Ukraine. For France, a nuclear war is a posthumous war. We don't have 12 time zones. In fact, for the whole world, it's a posthumous war, given the power of today's weapons. Or in fact, we just say it like that. To try to regain a central position within the European Union, which has completely shifted toward Atlanticism. We know we won't do it when the time comes, so we're just fooling everyone and weakening the French doctrine. It's a national doctrine, period. I said it during the 2024 debate. If there is to be any cession of territory, it must be discussed within the framework of international law and approved by the populations concerned. When I said that at the time, people were Putin lovers, because we were already talking about the possibility. But it was obvious that this idea was on everyone's mind, and the first one to talk about it was the one who was wrong. And now what are they doing, these hypocrites? They approve peace agreements without even seeking public opinion, including that of Ukrainians. So that's where we are. So the truth is, these have just been stances for the past 3 years, and you can't wage war or work for peace with just stances. It's serious work, diplomatic, political. We have to stop playing with people's fears. With shock, war, and peace are not games. That's what it makes me think of. The unraveling of, not of our diplomacy, because we have extremely competent diplomats, but of the head of French diplomacy, who is the president of the Republic. The war in Ukraine has come to confirm what we've been saying, what we know. What is a historical reality is that there is no European autonomy in terms of strategy, geopolitics, or defense. Call it whatever you want, first of all.
To have one.
We'll come back to that. In any case, there must not be any sovereignty. Me, I'm for independence, autonomy, whatever you want, but not sovereignty. Because sovereignty is the people, and sovereignty means the people in a democracy. The sovereign is the people. But we believe that as things stand, the way the European Union functions is far too undemocratic to consider that there is a European people in France. This was made clear when the rejection of the European Constitutional Treaty in 2005 was trampled on, and then it was simply repackaged as a regular treaty in 2007. But it was the same thing inside. So the notion of sovereignty must be handled with great care, especially for someone on the left. For a Jaresian, an heir of 1792, it's the people, it's no one else. On the other hand, we need more independence, especially at the European level. We are not against industrial cooperation, as long as it doesn't serve to strip our own industry. I refer to the way agreements with Germany in the name of European defense have constantly been used to strip part of our industry. Whether it's in the space sector, a strategic field with obvious links to military issues, or Nexter, and so on. The future combat air system, how our aviation industry, in short, Dassault, for example, with Trappier, especially in the Defense Committee, denounces the way this future combat air system primarily serves the interests of the German industry. In the end, we're sold big projects, but about 3/4 are just bought off the shelf from the United States. And to fatten up the American defense industry in the name of interoperability within NATO, and so on. The truth is, they're scared, many don't have the know-how, and they don't want to buy French so they don't upset the Americans, that's all. But none of this is new. There are people who think that Europe was built to be stronger, and so on. No, Europe was built as a market, and historically, there has always been a relationship of dependence. Within the Atlanticist framework, already, remember, we can go back to 1953. Why did the European defense community fail? The Federalists and the Atlanticists, they sum it up. Yes, there were national self-interests. No, that's not it. It's not national self-interests. Those are abstractions. Why did the European defense community fail? Even though at the beginning it was a French proposal, but a proposal from people who were convinced and Federalists, and it would end up being rejected by the French Parliament at the time when people listened to them when they voted, and especially because of an alliance between the Gaullists and the Communists. Why did they reject the European defense community, which was essentially the first attempt at a European defense system? But quite simply because it was written that this European defense, this European army, if it had been established, would be under American command, directly under NATO command, and that it would inevitably be an American general. It was written in black and white. Obviously, the Gaullists and the Communists couldn't accept that, and they were right to reject it. Since then, the Federalists have found other ways. They think that the tool creates the function. That's their big thing, so they're going to set up military cooperations. Then, mechanically, a Europe of defense will emerge, but that's not how it works. You need a strategy, a Europe of defense. It's not just about having enough equipment that's suitable and available, which is not the case. It also relies on a common doctrine, common interests, a shared view of international order, or a common approach to foreign policy. But in fact, Europe is full of contradictions on this subject. There are differences in interests and differences in worldview. When, in 2004, if I remember correctly, Many Eastern European countries joined NATO because that was the great period of NATO expansion. And that's a real issue. In the 1990s, NATO should have disappeared. It had lost its purpose, its reason for being. In fact, it only expanded geographically, which was also one of the reasons for the huge tensions with Russia. People might call me a Putin supporter for saying that, but I'm not. I'm repeating what the diplomats of that time said, who pointed out that there was a promise back then not to expand NATO, that NATO would remain within its historical borders. It kept expanding even after promises were made. Whether geographically, but also in its responsibilities, it was extended to war, to terrorism. That's why NATO intervened in Afghanistan, a very well-known Atlantic country, very well known for its Atlantic coast. That's how NATO formed partnerships with Jardine, very well known for its Atlantic coast, etc. And we're at the point now where currently no European defense project is conceived independently of NATO. So in fact, all European defense projects are seen as pillars of NATO, as appendages of NATO. And so there can't be any independent thinking, and we can see that. As a result, we can't think differently than Americans. Except that when the Americans change their doctrine, their choices for their own interests, or at least their own perceived interests, we end up high and dry, caught off guard. So that's enough, really, that's enough. There's something that might seem like common sense. We tell people, look, together we're stronger. That would be true if there was a possibility of having a coherent vision, but that's not the case. We take responsibility for saying that France has more to gain by reconnecting, by speaking beyond the West, by reconnecting with a time when it was heard beyond the West. That is, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. And it still has the means to do so, rather than focusing on a vision of the eastern shore of Europe. This was followed by Trump's deal, which is a capitulation. We commit to accepting to invest more than $700 billion in the United States, while it is urgent to make productive investments in Europe, especially in the digital sector. To be independent, because right now we've become a digital colony of the United States, and that's a real issue. It's a serious problem on every level. We no longer have our independence in that area. Interference can come from anywhere, of course, and often people muddy the waters by talking about Russian interference in digital matters, or possibly Chinese interference, and so on. But the heart of the problem is American, because
en fait,
the vast majority of the software used, the hardware used, and so on, are American in Europe. And so they impose their rules on us. You know about extraterritoriality, and it's a real issue when we're dealing with a digital economy that's largely dominated, including by far-right people who openly want to skew the results of elections in Europe and so on. So instead of going to invest $700 billion or promising to invest $700 billion, it's a war for attracting capital that Trump is waging. It's nothing else within the type of capitalism I mentioned earlier. He threatens you with the worst if you don't do what he wants. So instead of doing that, we need to invest in Europe and force them to invest in Europe. In the productive economy, meaning the one that creates jobs, that creates useful goods and products, etc., obviously by looking at the question of needs. And yes, and you said it as well, we spent $600 billion on energy purchases as if we weren't. Basically, we're just trading one dependency for another, Russian dependency for American dependency. All of this will end badly. We are in complete disagreement with that.
To change continents, we can move on to Africa. How do you analyze the French withdrawal from the Sahel? France has difficult relations with a number of countries. You yourself are a member of the France-Senegal Friendship Group. If I'm not mistaken, and you at least know the region, what alternatives do you advocate to potentially rebuild relations, especially with the Sahel countries?
Yes, actually, I was even the president of the France-Burkina Friendship Group before the coup, but now, well, there's no longer a parliament in Burkina, so it didn't make sense anymore. First, I want to clarify that it was a specific policy, not France, that was rejected. The results of Macron's policy in the region are disastrous, but we have to admit that he inherited this policy. Wasn't he the one who launched Operation Barkhane? We were in favor, for example, of Serval, but not of Barkhane. We said so as early as January 2014, or 2013, if I remember correctly. Mr. Mélenchon had said he was against Operation Barkhane because it would end badly, because there was no strategic vision. We weren't going to war like that, without a plan, without a clear, concrete objective. And we've seen the disaster. The war on terrorists doesn't work. That's not how you fight, how you reduce terrorist groups. And we had seen the result of that kind of stalemate, especially with the Americans in Afghanistan, etc. So it couldn't work. I pay tribute to the 58 soldiers, men and women, who died during Operation Barkhane. But we said from the start that it couldn't work. As a result, France has lost a lot of credibility. And especially because, for several reasons, first of all, an excessive militarization of relations with Africa. A purely security-based vision completely outdated that. Plus, in fact, the younger generations in Africa no longer want to see Western armies in their countries. That's how it is. And we can only understand them, even less so the armies of a country that was the colonial power. There is a desire for sovereignty, for independence, and that also goes through this. And you can't, on one hand, denounce, for example, a coup d'etat in Mali, and at the same time go and endorse the son of Deby in Chad, who takes the presidency outside of any constitutional framework. It doesn't work. People see it. Look, that's it. That's why we have made speeches that contradict Macron's policy in Africa, and now we are the other voice of France in Africa. There you go, Mr. Mélenchon. He's very influential there, especially because we said you make your own choices, actually. It's not up to us to decide who your leaders are, etc. For instance, in Senegal, we stated from the beginning that we don't agree with everything in the PASTEF program. However, it's ultimately up to the Senegalese people to choose their representatives. And when France was clinging on and supporting Macky Sall while he was putting his opposition in prison, etc., we were talking to his opposition. And as a result, we built ties and maintained relationships at a time when things were on the verge of breaking down. Now, the Macronists are asking us to help them speak with Senegal's leaders. So what should we do now? Give more resources to our diplomacy. We've had 30% fewer staff in diplomacy in Africa for a little over 20 years. That means less knowledge of the people, less interaction, and less presence. That's fundamental. We must end paternalism and the double standards I've mentioned since people are watching us. We need to put an end to a purely security-focused approach, which can lead to disasters. We're talking about the war in Sudan, which is terrible right now. Let me remind you that, in the name of defending borders and preventing migrants from reaching Libya, the European Union and France, unfortunately, have helped the rapid support forces who are massacring everyone in the west of the country. You can see for yourself. In 2015-2016, we provided material support with paramilitary equipment precisely in the name of fighting illegal immigration, and so on. In fact, we need to have a very different perspective, a vision first of all. We should remember that Africa is the future of the world, if only from a demographic point of view. And a part of this continent is French-speaking, so we have a lot to talk about. This refers to Mr. Mélenchon's conference in Ouagadougou in 2021, which centered on a new vision for the Francophonie, a popular, alter-globalist Francophonie. Because we need to break away from unequal trade agreements. Telling Africans what they have to do, it's as simple as that. And then we will redevelop strong bonds of friendship. Because there is a shared history, because there are many people with dual nationality, because it's in our best interest to get along. But we need to break away from a racist, security-focused vision, one that is shriveled up around a few financial interests, the last remnants of a declining France-Afrique.
With the expansion of the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and more broadly, the global South, how do you see this reshaping? Should we be in opposition to them? Is this the policy of the third way that you've already mentioned a bit throughout this video? For the conclusion, what place is there for a non-aligned France, which is somewhat the position of La France Insoumise? You specifically mentioned the Havana Charter of 1948 in committee, which is actually a kind of treaty somewhat against free trade. But international exchanges that are more based on the development of peoples so that they can prosper. But from a beneficial point of view for everyone, there would be no treaty aimed at exploiting people.
The Havana Charter. So I'm clarifying this for the listeners because it was before the arrival of Fidel Castro. I'm saying this because the debate on international issues has become so binary in the dominant ideology. In the end, when we hear Havana, Cuba, and so on, I reaffirm here that I stand in solidarity with the Cuban people in the face of the criminal embargo, which is illegal in any case, which is imposed on them. But there you have it. The Havana Charter. Indeed, it provided for, it went as far as what Keynes proposed, especially guaranteeing a balance in trade exchanges. For example, there was this idea that it was forbidden for trade balances to be too unbalanced between two countries. So that means you couldn't use dominant positions. So that left room for the emergence of endogenous economies, especially in Africa and in Latin America, and not just economies that were only on the periphery of global capitalism.
The possibility to subsidize emerging industries?
To subsidize, that was alter globalization before the term even existed. Well, we'd have to get into the details, but that's how it is. The United States refused it, the American Congress refused it. So anyway, that's that, and us. It still inspires many of our proposals, especially regarding solidarity-based protectionism. The protectionism we're proposing has nothing to do with what Trump is doing. We could come back to that quickly, but for now, I would like to remind you of the emergence of the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa in 2009, which includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and which have now been joined by a number of other countries. Currently, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa represent 45.5% of the world's population, 43% of global oil production, and almost 36% of the world's gross domestic product. These are figures from 2024 with global gross domestic product measured in purchasing power parity and almost 25% of total goods exports. So, it's obvious that, whether we like it or not, this is a force to be reckoned with. And these are the countries indeed that historically were not included in Western neoliberal globalization, but have developed their own. Within this framework of capitalist globalization, they have developed their own productive force, their own capacity, including military, and so on. These are countries that matter, whether we like it or not. So it is absolutely necessary to talk to everyone, and especially to the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. I would add that, well, some will say the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa don't mean anything. Look, they have plenty of disagreements among themselves. Between China and India, there are a lot of disagreements. Yes, certainly, but first of all, it's not a military alliance, so their purpose is to agree on the essentials, especially the redefinition of a number of rules of neoliberal globalization. It's in this context, for example, that there was a challenge to the policies the United States wanted to impose at the World Trade Organization, like the general liberalization of agriculture. That was the beginning of the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the opposition to that kind of policy. Then, these are countries that, contrary to what people say, do not want to destroy the international order. On the contrary, they tend to say that there are rules at the United Nations, etc. And they fit into it in any case, they invest themselves in it. At the same time, the United States, which I mentioned earlier, initially claimed to embody international law, etc., now no longer talks about international law. They talk about a rules-based order. Appearance. How should I put it? An expression that appeared around the time of the 2020-2021 NATO summit, if I remember correctly, in the words of Joe Biden. And if you want to go back, it's extremely insidious. That is to say, the rules are whatever we decide. It's not international law anymore, even if decided at the United Nations or written down, because international law no longer suits them. We can see it very clearly. There's a refusal to enforce it in the Middle East, to force Israel to respect this law and so on. But quite simply because the United States keeps the option of a military solution to their problems, especially when it comes to China, and so on. But on the other hand, we're not going to stop talking with the whole world, especially the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, just because they don't have exactly the same democratic models as we do. Because there's global warming, because there are a whole set of issues of general human interest that we have to address together whether we like it or not. For example, the reform of the international financial system, the dollar, the de-dollarization of the international financial system, it's moving forward no matter what. Advocated by the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, there may be national interests, but there is also a common interest. We also have an interest in moving away from the dominance of the dollar. For many reasons, that would take too long to go over now, especially because it's a condition for our independence. Because as soon as you trade in dollars, you fall under American law, sanctions, and so on. When they decide to target a particular country, and that goes hand in hand with the idea of non-alignment. So non-alignment, we have our own agenda. It's an independent diplomacy, alter-globalist, non-aligned, alter-globalist, as I said. It's about trying everywhere to expand the sphere of non-commercial common goods, especially at the United Nations. See them? We need to create a digital space that is free from rentier capitalism. We need treaties on the deep sea, treaties on equipment, treaties on space. I mean, we could multiply the examples. I invite you to take a look at our program. And then to control, for example, to set up a collective debt regulation within the framework of the United Nations, and not just the International Monetary Fund, etc. In 2015, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution proposing a collective approach to settling debt and public debts. Rather than leaving people at the mercy of the appetites of financial markets that get rich off debts, let's find a collective settlement of the debt. That's it, etc., etc. We could multiply the examples almost infinitely because anything can be considered a common good, can be part of the realm of common goods. Non-alignment means first refusing to let France consider itself primarily a Western country, which must be bound hand and foot, which would, for example, have a community of values and interests with the United States. That's what the Atlantics always tell us, right? No, France is a country that can talk to everyone and can make agreements with everyone, as long as it is done within the framework of international law, within the framework of the objectives of general human interest that I have already mentioned. And ultimately, non-alignment is the opposite of isolation. What isolates us, what shrinks us, what weakens us. What diminishes France is no longer having a global vision of the world. It was one of Gaulle's ambitions to speak beyond the West. When de Gaulle gave a speech in Phnom Penh against the Vietnam War in 1965, it didn't matter. It went global, regardless of what people think of de Gaulle. That's the key point. It went worldwide. Can anyone name a speech by Macron, Hollande, or Sarkozy that had the same global impact? The last time a speech went around the world was Mr. Villepin's speech on Iraq, refusing to let France go, and finally opposing the war in Iraq by the American neoconservatives. Look at countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia. They focus on multi-alignment. A country like India and France has an interest in moving away from this bloc vision, the Western bloc that is supposed to defend its values. You know, in the end, we don't even know what we're talking about anymore. If it's just about defending a few things, that's it. That's why. For example, we think that we should also join the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa Development Bank. Created in 2014, France would have an interest in doing so, and I could give many more examples. I would just like to finish by saying that
Ce que nous proposons comme alternative.
The alternative foreign policy we propose puts international law at the center. Why doesn't that sound very internationalist? Because there was a time when law was seen as something a bit bourgeois, right? International law has become revolutionary again because it's either that or generalized war, where war is once again considered a normal way of acting. Almost. There are 60 recorded conflicts in the world right now, which is a record since World War II. The urgent need is to fight for peace, and that's fundamental. It's in the general human interest, and it's in the interest of the French people. That's why we're fighting to put international law back at the center. And if we were in power, we would make the United Nations the main arena of French foreign policy again, at least in terms of its presentation and implementation. Why? Because it's urgent to put international law back at the center, because it's being trampled on, because it's considered useless. Even worse, now the United Nations is being accused of being anti-Semitic, no, the United Nations is simply reminding us of international law. But what happened in Gaza, the genocidal war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, the war in Sudan, but to a lesser extent, it's even more deadly, but it's not an international war, nor a colonial one. We've significantly undermined belief and trust in international law. Many claim it's now useless due to world leaders, but that's not true. When heads of state ignore international law, it's not the law that needs changing, but the heads of state. So, for us, defending international law is one of the principles, the backbone of our vision for foreign policy. And I'll end on that. For example, solidarity-based protectionism includes various alter-globalist measures. We propose to negotiate it notably by taking up ideas from the Havana Charter that you mentioned earlier. It has nothing to do with Trump-style protectionism, where I decide to terrorize anyone who doesn't accept certain conditions. Otherwise, I slap 200% tariffs on them, and so on. This causes chaos, even in the United States, since the United States economy is the first victim of this policy.